The Return of the Indian, Chapter 10, Boon's Brainwave. Yes, it's us all. It's us, said Patrick excitedly. He capered about stiff-legged, unable to contain himself. Omri, too, was over the moon. It is so good to see you, Boon, he cried, wishing he could wring the little man's hand and bang him on the back. Boon, who must have fallen off his horse at some point, now scrambled to his feet and dusted himself off. The horse came up behind him in the cupboard and nudged him forcefully in the back as if to say, I'm here too. Omri could just about stroke its tiny nose with the tip of his little finger. The horse bunted it, nodding its head up and down, and then exchanged whinnies with Little Bear's pony on the distant seed tray. And it's mighty good to see you fellers, Boon was saying warmly as he scrambled out of the cupboard. It's been more'n a mite dull without my hallucinations. Well, what do you know if it ain't the little Injun gal? Brightstars had taken a few steps toward him timidly. He raised his hat. Howdy, Injun lady. Hey, where's the other one? That redskin that made me his blood brother after he half killed me. He looked around the top of the chest, but Little Bear's matchbox bed had its back to him. Tarnation take me if I didn't miss that doggone varmint when I woke up last time. Or went back, or whatever you call it. He rubbed his shirt from front reminiscently. My old pals thought I'd gone plumb loco when I tried to tell him how I got my wound. Are you okay now, Boon? Me? I'm just fine. You can't kill old Boo-Hoo Boon so easy, even if he does look a lot might soft. So where's Little Bear? Let me shake the hand that shot me to show there ain't no hard feelings. Brightstars didn't understand much of this, but she heard Little Bear's name, and she took Boon by the arm and drew him over to the bed, and when Boon saw the prostrate figure of the Indian, he stopped short. Holy smoke, what happened to him? He got shot, too, by Frenchmen. Omri added in a low voice and signaled to Boon not to ask questions. But Boon was not the most tactful of men. Jehoshaphat, I never did trust those Frenchies. Got one running our saloon. Someday someone's going to run him right out of town. Waters the whiskey, you know, he added confidently to Brightstars. At the words whiskey, Little Bear opened his eyes as he had dropped off to sleep and tried to sit up. When he saw Boon bending over him, he let out a cry of recognition and then fell back again with a hand on his bandaged chest. Oh, gee, the poor old savage, said Boon, shaking his head. He sniffed. Not that he probably didn't deserve it. They're always up to no good, but all the same, I can't stand to see a man in pain. He wiped away a tear. He's much better now, said Patrick. There's nothing to start crying about. Boon blew his nose loudly and plonked himself down on the bed. Tell me the whole thing, he said. Not now, said Omri hurriedly. Why in thunder not? I gotta hear sometime. Come on, Injun. Are you ashamed of something you done to that Frenchie to make him take a shot at you? Little Bear lay on the bed and stared up at Boon, and there was a sudden tension in the air as they all, Brightstars too, waited for him to remember, to ask. Slowly he raised himself onto his elbows, and his eyes had gone narrow and his face taut and scowling, and suddenly he opened his eyes wide, and he let out a wild cry. Ah! Brightstars put her hand to her face and turned and fled up the ramp and into the teepee. What got into her? Boon asked, looking after her puzzled. But another anguished cry transfixed them all. Little Bear, remember! Soldiers come! Burn village! Burn corn! Many, many! He opened and closed his hands rapidly, holding up 10 fingers again and again. Iroquois braves fight, but not enough. Not got guns, horses. Enemy break, burn, steal, kill, kill! His voice cracked and he stopped speaking. Another man might have broken down and wept, but Little Bear just stared, wild-eyed and frozen-faced. His mouth was shut in a straight line, like a knife cut in his hard face. Only his hands quivered at his sides, and his fingers became hooks. Gee whiz, feller, said Boon at last. That's too bad. There was a long silence, and nobody moved, and Little Bear lay on his back, his eyes open. He seemed to be neither fully awake nor asleep. Omri passed a finger back and forth in front of those staring eyes, and they didn't respond. Omri, Patrick, and Boon looked anxiously at each other. What shall we do? Nothing, said Boon. Poor guy's had a shock. It happened to me once. I came to after I got knocked out in some kind of ruckus, and I couldn't remember a thing, and I started talking and drinking just like everything was normal, and all of a sudden it just came back to me. I'd seen a lynching, a hanging. A mob of coyotes had strung a fellow up for something he didn't even do. It was the most horriblest thing I ever saw, and I just laid there seeing it over and over again, and it took me a dang long time to get over it. And that wasn't so bad neither as what he's seeing now, poor critter. He's seen a war. They came at his village. Tears of sympathy were streaming down the cowboy's leathery cheeks. Them rotten Frenchies mixing in, sneaking up on him that-a-way and scaring the women folk that-a-way. Gee, I sure would like to help them poor folk if it hadn't happened so long ago." This showed an extraordinary change of heart for Boone, who had been absolutely down on Indians when they first knew him. And Army said, "Well, if we send them back now, it would all still be going on, and if you wanted to help, maybe we could send you back to their time. If Little Bear just held on to you, you'd all go back together." Boone, who had his face buried in his red bandana, froze for a moment, and his eyes slowly appeared above the red spotted cloth. "May?" he said in a quavering voice. "Well, you said you'd like to help. You've got a gun after all, and you don't like them Frenchmen. Maybe you'd like to shoot a few of them." "Before they shoot me," finished Boone. "That's a great idea. Thanks a lot. Things is tough and dangerous enough where I come from. I mean, when I come from, without going back 100 years to when things was 10 times worse. Come to think of it, what's stopping you from lending a hand to help those redskins if you're so crazy about 'em?" Patrick and Army looked at each other, startled. "Well, we can't go back," Patrick said. "How could we? We can't fit into the cupboard." Boone looked at them and looked consideringly at the small bathroom cabinet, less than a foot high, and then back at the boys again. "Well, that's true," he said grudgingly, "and I reckon I can't argue about that, but there's still a way I can think of that you could help 'em if you have a mind ter." "How?" they asked at once. "Well, what's that down there over yonder? It's so dang far away I can't see it properly, but it looks to me like a whole bunch of folks laying in a heap in a box." The boys looked at where he was pointing, and down the floor was a biscuit tin full of Omri's collection of plastic figures. He'd gone up in the loft that morning to fetch it, and now he lifted it and put it on the chest, and the top of which was now getting rather crowded. "Lift me up and let me look," ordered the little man. Patrick put his hand down close to him, and Boone heaved himself onto it as if he were scrambling onto a horse without a saddle. Patrick flew him over the box, and he lay down flat and peered over the side of Patrick's hand, hanging onto his precious hat. "Well, look at that. What you think you got down there if it ain't all kinds of men with all kinds of shooting irons? Even you could stick 'em all in the cupboard and bring 'em to life, and then send 'em back with the Injuns. They'd come out on the other end and send them Frenchies scooting back to France as fast as grease lightning." Army and Patrick looked at each other. "Would it work?" said Patrick, his eyes alight. Army could see it was not just the possibility of helping the Indians that was getting him excited. From the very beginning, Patrick had wanted to experiment with the cupboard. Army had barely been able to prevent him from stuffing dozens of soldiers in, bringing whole armies to life and making them fight. This looked just like an excuse he'd been wanting. The idea had a strong appeal for Army, too, but he was more cautious. "We'd have to think about it," he said. Patrick almost slammed his hand with Boone on it down again on the chest. "You're always thinking," he said disgustedly. "Why don't we just try it?" Army was frowning, trying to imagine. "Listen." He picked up a knight in chainmail with a big helmet and a shield with a red cross on the white ground. "If we put this one in, for instance, he'd come to us from the time of Richard I. He wouldn't know a thing about Indians. He'd want to go off to Palestine and kill Saracens." He put the knight down and picked up a soldier in a flat cap and khaki shorts. "This one's a French-born legionnaire. We couldn't even talk to him, let alone to an Arab tribesman or a Russian Cossack. They were great fighters, but they just wouldn't agree to be in the army fighting Frenchmen in America on the side of the Indians. They're not toys. Every one of them is a person. I mean, if we brought them to life, we'd have to explain everything. Half of them wouldn't believe it. Others might think they'd gone crazy." But Patrick interrupted with high impatience. "Oh, what are you on about? Who's talking about soldiers with swords and axes and old-fashioned pop guns? What about these?" He dug his hand into the tin and came up with a fistful of British soldiers. Some had self-loading rifles, others had submachine guns. There was a howitzer, a 37mm anti-tank gun, 3 rocket launchers, and a variety of grenades. Army stared at the firepower bristling out between Patrick's fingers. They had an army there, all right. Patrick was already moving toward the cupboard, the handful of soldiers ready to thrust in. "No," said Army, as he had once before. "Stop." "I'm going to do it," said Patrick. Just at that moment, they heard footsteps coming up the stairs, and as one, they turned and sat on the very edge of the chest, facing the door, forming a human screen to block the people behind them. Army's mother put her head in. "Patrick, your mother just called. Your cousin Tamsin has had a nasty fall on her bicycle, and your mother's going to help, and she's going to stay and help your aunt, and so you won't have to go home today." Patrick's face lit up. "Great, that means I could stay the night here?" "Well, I'm sorry about your poor cousin." "I'm not," said Patrick promptly. "I hope she broke a leg." "Really, Patrick, that is not nice." "She's not nice," said Patrick feelingly. Army's mother was looking at them curiously. "You do look odd sitting there like Tweedledum and Tweedledee," she said. "Are you hiding something from me?" "Yeah," said Army, It was always better to be quite honest with his parents if possible. Luckily, they didn't expect to be in on everything he did. "Oh, well," she said, "I hope it's nothing too awful. There'll be a bite of lunch in a little while. I'll call you." And she went off. Patrick slumped with relief. "She's just not normal, your mom," he muttered. "Mine wouldn't have rested till she had a good look." He brought his hand from behind his back and opened it and looked at the soldiers. The uncontrollable impulse to put them in the cupboard had subsided, but he still wanted to very badly. Omri could see that. Bright Stars was calling them. She had come to Little Bear's bedside again and was now helping him to struggle into a sitting position. "I don't think he should sit up just yet," said Omri anxiously. "Not sit up." Bright Stars was looking very worried, but Little Bear brushed her aside, gritting his teeth. "Little Bear, sit. Stand. Go back and fight." "No, you can't. You're not strong enough." "I strong enough. I chief. Chief not sit in far place when tribe in trouble. Omri put in box. Omri send back. Chief Little Bear say." But Omri was adamant. "You're not going anywhere till you're better." He looked into the Indian's face. He understood very well how he must be feeling, like a deserter, even though his getting shot and being here was no fault of his own at all. Once Omri had been away on a week's school trip, and when he got back, he found out when he'd been gone, his mother, alone in the house, had cut herself very badly on a broken bottle. With her hand pouring blood, she had managed to get to the phone, an ambulance had come, and she was soon in the hospital and safe. None of all of this was any fault of Omri's or anyone's, but he felt terrible, really guilty about having been so far away. So it wasn't hard to imagine how badly Little Bear felt the need to get back to help his people. After all, he was their chief. He was responsible for them. Who knew what was happening at the Indian encampment at this very moment? Bright Stars was thinking about it too. She was torn, Omri could see, between wanting to keep Little Bear in bed and wanting him to go back and do what he had to do. "Let's tell him about Boon's idea," suggested Patrick. "It might take his mind off going back right away himself." "Yeah, I had me an idea, all right," chimed in Boon. "Say, why don't we have us a bite to eat, not to mention a swig of liquor, and talk my idea over? Ain't nothing like whiskey for helping your brain work. Ain't that so, kid?" First of all, does alcohol make you think better or worse? What do you think? It does not make you think better. It kind of destroys brain cells, but Boon thinks it helps him think better. So Omri crept downstairs and extracted a small glassful of scotch from his parents' drink cupboard and some food from the table which his mother had laid out for lunch. She was not much of a fancy table layer, and all there was at the moment was rye vita, butter, and some rather tired-looking olives, but that was better than nothing, and he grabbed a bit of each and hurried upstairs again. He should have known better than to leave the room. He left Patrick alone in the room. As he opened the door, he was greeted by the noise that sounded like a loud chattering of teeth. Then there was a distinct pop, and something went ping against the glass of whiskey he was carrying. His eyes flashed to the cupboard, and there on the shelf in the middle of it were 5 miniature soldiers raking the room with machine gun fire. On the chest below were several more, and they were manning a small but lethal-looking artillery piece. Omri had no time to think. Dropping everything, he threw up his hand to protect his face and dashed forward through a hail of tiny bullets that bit into his palm like wasp stings. Patrick was standing aghast, too stunned it seemed to do anything. Omri fell on the little men in their khaki uniforms, scooped them up, weapons and all, and shoved them back into the cupboard, slamming the door. He heard another couple of rounds and the muffled boom of an exploding hand grenade against the inside of the door before he could gather his wits and turn the key. Silence fell on the bedroom. Omri's first act was to glance over his shoulder to check that Little Bear, Bright Stars, and Boon were all right. There was a line of bullet holes through the top of the headboard of the matchbox bed, but mercifully, Bright Stars must have persuaded Little Bear to lie down just before the shooting started, and he was okay. He would have been killed if he would have been sitting up. Bright Stars was holding the 2 horses which were on Patrick's paddock, and they were rearing and plunging with terror, letting out shrill neighs while Bright Stars hung on to their reins. Boon was at first glance nowhere to be seen, but then Omri made out a tiny pair of cowboy boots and spurs sticking out from under the ramp. He must have dived for cover when the attack began. Not particularly heroic, but certainly by far the most sensible move upon him at the time. Next, Omri gave an attention to his hand, and 6 droplets of blood oozed from as many tiny breaks in the skin. Remembering when Patrick had had a bullet in his cheek from Boone's gun once, Omri quickly started squeezing out the bullets, lodging just under his skin between finger and thumbnail. He didn't say a word to Patrick. What was the use? Some people never learn. But Patrick had something to say, and in a voice that shook, he said, "I could have gotten them all killed." Omri bit his lip. The bullets were actually just visible, minute black specks. It hurt getting them out, but it was rather satisfying, like squeezing a blackhead. I just wanted to see what would happen, Patrick said pleadingly. Well, now you've seen. Thanks a lot. I'm sorry. You're always desperately sorry when you've done something thick. Patrick didn't argue. He bent down and pulled Boon out from under the ramp by his feet. It's okay, Boon. They've gone. The little man was gibbering and shaken from head to foot. Who in tarnation were those guys? He managed to ask. Soldiers. From when? Now, approximately. Boy, am I glad I'll be dead before that kind of shooting starts, he said fervently. Did they get you, kid? He asked Omri anxiously as a drop of blood splashed onto the chest beside him. Only a bit, said Omri, pressing a wedge of Kleenex to his hand. Did you get any of the hard stuff? Boon asked eagerly. Now I really need some. Oh, I must have dropped it. Boone's face fell, but when Omri went to the door, he found that although the glass had fallen to the floor, spilling most of the scotch, it hadn't broken, and there was still a little left in the bottom. He offered the glass to Boone, who promptly heaved himself up over the rim and dived in head first. Hanging onto the rim by his boots, he started lapping up the dregs of whiskey like a puppy. Omri couldn't help laughing. Oh, come on, Boone, you can't be that thirsty. Remember, you're supposed to be civilized? And he hiked him out and poured the last drops into a toothpaste cap mug. Save some for Little Bear. Boone looked shocked. You can't go giving liquor to Injuns, don't you know that? It drives them crazy. They just ain't got the heads for it. Anyway, you can't give him any. He's too sick. When you were wounded, you said whiskey made you feel better. Oh, yeah, I guess I did say that. He gazed sorrowfully down at his mug. Well, if you really want to risk it, I only don't blame you if he goes loco there. He handed the mug to Omri, who passed it to Little Bear, who was sitting up again, examining the bullet holes in his bed. Boone sent you some whiskey, Little Bear. Not once, said the Indian at once. Why not? I thought you liked it. Firewater for feast, for make happy, take from trouble. Little Bear must keep head, must think, then act. Give firewater to Boone. He not need think. He said Boone doesn't need to think. Boone received his drink back without reluctance. Omri picked up some bits of rivita and olive from the floor, and soon the little people were all munching, although their opinions of olives were evidently not high. So my idea could work, Boone remarked after draining his drink. 10 fellows like them, soldiers with guns like that, and those Frenchies would be on their knees, if they had any left, begging the Redskins to make powwow. Patrick, who'd been standing at the window, turned around. That's what I was thinking, he said. Omri felt quite exasperated. How could they both be so stupid? What do you think, Little Bear? Boone asked eagerly. Or Patrick asked eagerly, I'm sorry. What if we made lots of soldiers like that real and then joined them all to you somehow and sent them back together to your village? They could fight the Frenchmen for you. Little Bear grew still. His black eyes moved under his scowling brows from one of them to the other. For a moment, Omri feared he would jump at this tempting solution, but then reluctantly he shook his head. No good, he said gruffly. Oh, why not? They just shoot them into mincemeat in 2 minutes, and you got to be rid of them forever. They'd never dare to come back and bother you no more. Now soldiers not belong, said Little Bear. They not fight for Little Bear people. They fight on sight of French soldier. If at all, said Omri. Much more likely they'd just sit down and refuse to fight anyone. Once they realized they weren't where they ought to be. We could explain to them, said Patrick. You try explaining to a whole bunch of soldiers who are probably in the middle of World War II or in Northern Ireland that they're not fighting the Nazis or the IRA. They're about to go off and shoot 18th century Frenchmen in the middle of New York. Well, who could you explain it to? And that was when Omri had his brainwave. I'll tell you who. Other Indians. Little Bear's head came around and he saw the point at once. Yeah, he said immediately. What? Said Patrick. What you mean, kid? Said Boone. Listen, said Omri excitedly. What we have to do is go out and buy loads of Indians, Iroquois like Little Bear. He'll tell us what sort of clothes and things to look out for, although I think I know anyway, and then we'll bring them to life, and Little Bear can talk to them, and we can send them all back together when Little Bear's better, and... Send back now, most soon. I better now, Little Bear shouted. Bright Stars came running to calm him, but he wouldn't be calmed. He began shouting at her in its own language. She seemed very excited and clapped her hands and looked up at Omri with the shining eyes that had given her her name. Spirits know Omri save, she said. Save village, too. But Little Bear said something else on his mind. Now guns, he said. What? Omri said, not understanding. Now soldiers no good, but now guns good. Get Iroquois brave plastic, many. Then give braves now guns, like one make hole in bed. Is that a good idea? Bring Indians back and give them now guns? What do you think?